This is VOA News. I'm Joe Ramsey. Israel freed 2 hostages held by U.S. designated terrorist group Hamas in Rafah on Monday in a rescue operation which killed dozens of Palestinians in the southern Gaza City, where about 1 million civilians have sought refuge from months of bombardments. Reuters correspondent Angela Johnston reports.
In the operation, Israel says it freed 2 hostages held by Hamas. Israeli Argentines Fernando Simon Marman and Louis Har. They were among about 250 people taken hostage during the October 7th raid by militants that triggered Israel's war on Gaza. Israel said airstrikes were launched so its forces could get out. Hamas's armed wing says 3 hostages died in their aftermath, without elaborating. People in the city said 2 mosques and several residential buildings were hit in more than an hour of strikes.
Reuters correspondent Angela Johnston. U.S. President Joe Biden said on Monday the United States is pushing for a 6-week pause in the fighting between Israel and Hamas in Gaza as a stepping stone toward a larger ceasefire.
We're actively working for peace, security, and dignity for both the Palestinian people and the Israeli people. And I'm working on this day and night.
Judges in the Netherlands have ordered the Dutch government to halt the export of F-35 fighter jet parts to Israel, citing a clear risk of violations of international law. A trio of human rights organizations brought a civil suit against the Netherlands in December. They argue the delivery of parts for the aircraft makes the Netherlands complicit in possible war crimes. A lower court sided with the government in January. The decision can be appealed. This is VOA News. Former U.S. President Donald Trump is again distorting how NATO works by saying he once warned an alliance member about what would happen if it did not pay its bills. AP correspondent Sagar Magani reports.
At a weekend rally, Trump said a NATO leader once asked if the U.S. would protect his nation from Russian attack if that nation did not contribute enough to military spending.
You didn't pay? You're delinquent? He said, yes, let's say that happened. No, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want. You got to pay.
But that's not how it works. NATO members are expected to devote 2% of their GDP to defense, but they don't actually pay to be in NATO, whose founding document calls for collective defense. An attack on one ally is an attack on all. Sagar Magani, Washington.
Former U.S. President Donald Trump is asking the Supreme Court to extend the delay in his election interference trial and ultimately find him immune from prosecution on charges he plotted to overturn his 2020 election loss. His lawyers filed an emergency appeal with the court on Monday, just 4 days after the justices heard Trump's separate appeal to remain on the presidential ballot. Condolences are pouring in after Kenyan marathon world record holder Kelvin Kiptum died in a car crash in western Kenya late Sunday night. VOA's Nairobi bureau chief Mariama Jallo has this report.
Kelvin Kiptum was a star, said a social media post Monday from Kenyan President William Ruto. Ruto noted that Kiptum was only 24, yet had triumphed in several major competitions. His mental strength and discipline were unmatched. Kiptum was our future, Ruto's post said. Kiptum was the first man to run a marathon in under 2 hours, 1 minute, when he set the world record of 2 hours and 35 seconds in Chicago last October, beating the previous record holder, Kenya's Eliud Kipchoge. Mariama Jallo, VOA News, Nairobi.
Carnival dancers have taken the biggest stage in Rio de Janeiro to pay tribute to Brazil's largest indigenous group and pressure President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva to deliver on promises to eradicate illegal mining. Carnival has long been a platform for samba schools to protest. Participants marched on Sunday evening, delivering their message to more than 70,000 revelers and millions watching live on television. A year ago, Lula declared a public health emergency for the Yanomami group in the Amazon. They suffer from malnutrition and diseases such as malaria as a consequence of illegal mining. I'm Joe Ramsey, VOA. This is VOA News. I'm Joe Ramsey. Officials have said Israel and U.S. designated terrorist group Hamas are making progress in ceasefire and hostage release talks. AP correspondent Karen Jamas reports.
An Israeli tank rolls near Gaza on the southern Israeli border as explosions could be heard from inside the enclave. Negotiations between the two sides have been continuing in Cairo, a day after Israeli forces rescued 2 captives in Rafah. More than 70 Palestinians were killed in the raid. The mass destruction and death was a glimpse of what a full-scale Israeli ground advance into the area would look like. A ceasefire deal, on the other hand, would give people in Gaza a desperately needed respite from Israel's offensive, now in its 5th month. I'm Karen Chamas.
The head of Lebanon's Hezbollah said on Tuesday his armed group's cross-border shelling into Israel would only end when Israel's quote-unquote aggression on Gaza stops, saying diplomatic efforts so far to bring a halt to hostilities along Lebanon's border only seem to benefit Israel. Syed Hassan Nasrallah said his group would only stop its exchanges of fire if a full ceasefire was reached for Gaza. The head of the United Nations nuclear watchdog warned on Tuesday Iran is not entirely transparent regarding its atomic program. That's after an official who once led Tehran's program announced the Islamic Republic has all the pieces for a weapon, quote, in our hands. Rafael Mariano Grossi, the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, said there's loose talk about nuclear weapons more and more, including in Iran recently. Iran has been enriching uranium closer than ever to weapons-grade levels. This is VOA News. U.S. President Joe Biden on Tuesday pushed lawmakers to act quickly on a massive aid package for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan passed by the Senate. Reuters correspondent Freddie Joyner reports.
After a Senate vote that easily surpassed the chamber's 60-vote threshold for passage, the bill to approve roughly $95 billion in aid for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan was sent to the House of Representatives on Tuesday. But the foreign aid package faces an uncertain future in the Republican-controlled House.
This is a critical act for the House to move. It needs to move. The bill provides urgent funding for Ukraine so it can keep defending itself.
President Joe Biden pressed the chamber to move on the bill swiftly.
Reuters correspondent Freddie Joyner. Indonesians started voting in eastern areas of the vast country on Wednesday in an election headlined by the race to succeed popular President Joko Widodo, whose influence could determine who takes the helm of the world's third-largest democracy. Nearly 259,000 candidates are contesting 20,000 posts across 17,000 islands in the world's biggest single-day election, but all eyes are on the presidency and the fate of Widodo's ambitious agenda after a decade in charge of Southeast Asia's biggest economy. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights is alarmed by rising tensions in Senegal and is calling for a broad-based, inclusive elections to be held as soon as possible. Lisa Schlein reports for VOA from Geneva.
Volker Turk, the United Nations human rights chief, says he is deeply concerned by the rise in violence and increasing violations of human rights following last week's suspension of the presidential election, which had been set for February 25th. His spokeswoman, Liz Throssell, says initially peaceful protests have since turned violent. She says at least 3 young men have been killed and at least 266 people reportedly have been arrested, including journalists, during protests across the country. Lisa Schlein for VOA News, Geneva.
The Kansas City Chiefs' overtime defeat of the San Francisco 49ers in the Super Bowl, with Taylor Swift cheering in the stands, drew a record 123.7 million U.S. viewers, according to Nielsen estimates on Tuesday. It was not only the largest viewership recorded in the 58-year history of the Super Bowl, but also, according to Nielsen data, the biggest U.S. audience for any event since the first astronauts walked on the moon in 1969. The audience figure also includes those who watched in places such as bars and restaurants. I'm Joe Ramsey.
Ashley Thompson.
And I'm Dan Novak.
This is VOA News. I'm Joe Ramsey. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said on Wednesday U.S.-designated terrorist group Hamas presented no new offer for a Gaza hostage deal in talks in Cairo this weekend, and Israel would not agree to its current demands. Netanyahu said, "I insist that Hamas should abandon its delusional demands, and when it does, we will be able to move forward." Diplomacy is focused not just on halting the war and securing the hostages' release, but also on preventing the conflict from spreading across the region. Hamas is a U.S.-designated terrorist group. The families of Israelis held in hostage in Gaza, as well as some former captives, have visited the International Criminal Court in The Hague. AP correspondent Karen Chamas reports.
They're there to urge prosecutors to charge and seek the arrest of leaders of Hamas. It's the latest step in efforts by Israelis to seek justice for victims of the October 7th attack on southern Israel. Their visit comes a day after officials said that negotiations between Israel and Hamas are making progress towards another ceasefire and hostage release deal. ICC prosecutor Karim Khan is already investigating alleged crimes committed by both sides in the conflict. I'm Karen Chamas.
A former general linked to past human rights abuses has claimed victory in Indonesia's presidential election. The result would raise questions about the commitment to democratic values in the sprawling island nation that is the world's third largest democracy. Defense Minister Prabowo Subianto presented himself as an heir to immensely popular sitting President Joko Widodo, whose son was his running mate. There was no declaration by election officials. The two former provincial governors who also competed in the balloting did not concede defeat. This is VOA News. Democratic U.S. President Joe Biden and a bipartisan group of lawmakers, including the top U.S. Senate Republican on Wednesday, urged the Republican-controlled House of Representatives to take up a $95 billion military aid package for Ukraine and other allies. Reuters correspondent Zachary Goldman reports.
The United States and its allies are worried about how long Ukraine can hold off the Russians if the funding is not approved soon.
Далі Палата представників, голосування конгресменів там.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky thanked the Senate for passing the bill on Tuesday and said he hoped a vote in the House would happen quickly. Britain's Foreign Secretary David Cameron on Wednesday urged lawmakers to move forward with the bill.
The whole world is going to be watching what happens in Congress.
Republicans have a thin majority in the House. Both chambers of Congress must approve the legislation before Biden can sign it into law.
Reuters correspondent Zachary Goldman. The Republican head of the U.S. House Intelligence Committee is urging President Joe Biden's administration to declassify information about what he calls a serious national security threat. A senior congressional aide says the issue appears to relate to a space-deployed Russian anti-satellite weapon that may or may not have already been launched. The aide spoke on condition of anonymity due to the sensitivity of the matter. Special Counsel Jack Smith has urged the U.S. Supreme Court to let former President Donald Trump's 2020 election interference case proceed to trial without further delay. Prosecutors were responding Wednesday to a Trump team request from earlier in the week asking for a continued pause in the case as the court considers whether to take up the question of whether the former president is immune from prosecution for official acts in the White House. At least one person was killed and more than a dozen injured after gunfire rings out at the Super Bowl victory parade for the Kansas City Chiefs in the U.S. state of Missouri on Wednesday. AP correspondent Jackie Quinn reports.
It was supposed to be a day for celebration and fun, and then there was deadly gunfire.
I'm angry.
Kansas City, Missouri Police Chief Stacy Graves.
The people who came to this celebration should expect a safe environment.
The gunfire, after the team had left, sent terrified fans running for cover. Parade goers captured video of people giving victims emergency care. Last year, there was a shooting after the Denver Nuggets championship parade and in Texas for the Rangers World Series celebration. I'm Jackie Quinn.
Find more news and information on our website, voanews.com, or download the VOA News mobile app. I'm Joe Ramsey.